In this new Victoria 3 gameplay, we started as Prussia, however, quickly moved through across to those German states and combined with them in a fairly peaceful way to form the North German Federation. In this video, we'll continue to see revolution across the world in some unusual places as well, or at least unusually timed, and many trains too. Thank you so much as well for everybody who's subscribed. I set a target of 30,000 a few days ago, and my God, are you smashing it out of the park? Thank you so much. I think we will actually get there before Victoria 3 releases. Speaking of Victoria 3, let's not muck around and jump straight in to the North German Federation, where we see a few issues that need to be addressed by the developers. By the way, link below if you want to check out the full gameplay. I would encourage that you do. It's available on the Paradox Interactive channel, if you're wondering. Now, they're balancing a few things here. They are, as you will have noticed, trying to reset the budget, increase taxes, but crucially, it's about consolidating power and pushing for revolution. And that's really a theme not just in their state, but across the world in this new Victoria 3 gameplay. The big thing is the liberal revolution, the move away from their autocratic king, a more conservative state, and a push towards the liberalization. That means extra voting rights, maybe a little bit of education thrown in the mix, and a few other things that they'll work towards. You can see the good word of the revolution continues to play out, but this also leads them to increase support for radicalism, radicals within the nation that are not only stripping away from our GDP, but also having various other effects, making it hard to pass laws, etc. That's also not helped by a government that is a little fragmented. The overall goal here that you will have noticed from their Springtime of the People sort of overarching event, it's called a journal entry. Doesn't really matter, that's just semantics. The thing that they're trying to do is to marginalize any one radical interest group or potentially shift their nation to a republic. These are the two ways that they can help to consolidate power, which will inevitably probably be a little more liberal than the power that it's replacing, and try and move the North German Federation through revolution. It's a really difficult balance for them, and as you can see, it's not one without issues. There are internal events and political problems playing out here as well, as they try and balance out, try and lift up those groups that they want, the more liberal groups, and suppress those that aren't quite on their side. Here are those goals again one more time, so you can see the kind of things that they're working towards, away from monarchy towards more universal suffrage, and trying to suppress those interest groups. When it comes to ending a revolution in Victoria 3, then, we have to consider that journal entry, which, as I say, kind of acts as, well, sort of like a quest log or an objective entry. It's essentially meant to guide the player in an overarching way as their nations reform or struggle. Here you can see they're looking at the government screen, playing around with different interest groups, bringing them in and out of government, and you can see that having an effect on the legitimacy, something that is, as we discussed in yesterday's video, super important if they want to pass any kind of laws and introduce new institutions. More on those a little later in the video. As they struggle here with the different interest groups, there's also a really fascinating thing playing out. Currently, under their absolute monarchy, they have a fairly powerful legitimacy balance, as you can just see. But what they need to do is try and keep that while also suppressing the trade, no, not the trade unionists, the military. I know, seems a little odd. Why? Well, our king, as I mentioned earlier, belongs to the armed forces. The literal character has an armed forces trait, right? And a rich history of. So too does the heir, which we'll discover a little later. Another unfortunate thing for the monarchy. We're trying to suppress the armed forces, that conservative group, not really in line with our new liberal ideals, and if we suppress them, it'll help us with our overarching goal too. So then the tactic here becomes somewhat straightforward. We need to raise our legitimacy by concentrating power into the interests that we want, and to reform the state in a more liberal way, in this case moving towards things like universal suffrage or even census suffrage, and away from that autocratic rule. The other interesting thing to note here, though, that the developers talk about a little bit is that revolution progress, that overarching revolution over on the right-hand side of the screen here, is actually capped by the radicalism percentage within our nation. So there's a sort of a conflicting of ideals here. One group trying to preserve authority and autocracy, the other pushing for radicalism. We can therefore increase our legitimacy, reform the government, by suppressing interest groups that are standing against us. In this case, it may be the Junker, landowners, so as to pass universal suffrage and stretch out across the world with this liberal revolution that we're also at least helping to somewhat support, sowing the seeds of revolution. This will become much more important as we move through the rest of this video and those seeds begin to plant themselves in other nations around this, what I have to say is actually a pretty neat looking map. However, now we reach a key turning point in our nation, and it's not the fact that pharmaceuticals and fieldworks are unlocked, but that is neat. It's the fact that we now have universal suffrage. In a slow-mo celebration, you can see that the radicals, Junkers, not so happy. Everyone else, though, pretty stoked. This is a vital step, of course, towards shifting away from the monarchy, but it will also enable us to pass a whole load of other laws, but crucially, reform that government that we were talking about earlier. Now, we can also see political parties start to be formed. The Conservative Party that I mentioned earlier, made up of the armed forces in this case, and the Free-Minded People's Party, which at the moment is the industrialists, but as you can see, the devs are able to just slam a whole load of interest groups, all rallied not necessarily behind a whole load of shared goals, but absolutely rallying against the armed forces conservatism that is currently upholding the constitutional monarchy, right? These interest groups want a parliamentary republic or similar. As you can see, there's another election in 175 days. This gives us, as we know, an opportunity in Victoria 3 to reform the government for free with no real extra costs, or crucially, it doesn't reduce stability like, say, wildly and abruptly reforming a government. That could lead to revolution. And as we look across the world, we can see revolutionary China here playing out in a slightly alternative timeline to the normal. We also see Tibet potentially reaching out, grabbing some extra states, and Russia decides to eat a little bit of Japan in a really interesting way as well, taking a bite out of Hokkaido and then just kind of stabbing a piece out the middle as well. There's the extra territory that I believe Tibet took from the Heavenly Kingdom, or similar. As you can see, the world is ripe full of revolution as these ideas, that the conflicting ideas, the path to liberalism versus conservatism continue to play out here as well. The devs look back at their journal entry and my goodness, they're not short of things to do. Of course, you don't have to do any or all of these. You can pick and choose exactly how you want, but they do seem to act as a pretty good guide for them to steer their gameplay, in this case helping them build that sort of overarching move towards universal suffrage and away from those old conservative ideas. Here you can see parliamentary republic, presidential republic, now options available. The support for them isn't massive, but it will continue to grow. And of course, the newly formed government, still operating underneath the constitutional monarchy at this stage, is able to push through all kinds of ideas that they weren't able to do when the armed forces and that conservative party had such a hold over power, in combination, of course, with their monarch. If you don't already know, I tend to cut and splice and fast forward sections of these live streams so that you can get a more concise feel for Victoria 3. And we're going to do that now. As I jump ahead a little bit, we're now 15 years into the game. A reminder that the game runs from 1836 to 1936, right? About 100 years. And we can see that a few things are starting to fracture around the world. Internally, though, landowners and the restoration of autocracy camp are being suppressed, and liberalism continues to rise. As we look overseas a little bit, we can see fracturing in what will be Canada, the US, Mexico. The Central American contingency or federation has broken up a little bit as well, and it's led to fracturing of a few different states down here. The Americas as a whole are really, like the rest of us, struggling a little bit with internal politics and revolution, right? All kinds of ideas are going around, and they're very conflictual with one another. Take a look at all of the different states popping up here. We also see some revolution in Africa as well. The US trying to keep a hold of their territories there as well. They, of course, don't really have a lot these days. And then over towards Asia and Oceania, we can see China even more fractured than it's ever been. There's now sort of at least 4. If we look towards Japan and Russia, we could say 6, 7 different fairly significant powers vying for control here as well. As we look to other parts of the map, though, it's really important to note that all kinds of crazy things have gone on. There's a Russian seaport in Ottoman territory. As we look down south, we can see the federalization of Australia as well. As cowgirly politics continues to play out, I can't help but look longingly down towards New Zealand there too, where Australia continues to have a slice of the pie. Either way, all sorts of politics are playing out across the world. But when we look back to our own home shores, avoiding the weird seaports and various things that are playing out and continue to play out in places like China, we see some interesting things at bay. And it's largely due to our strange coalition party, made up of rural folk, trade unionists, the PB, the intelligentsia, and industrialists. There are, of course, a whole load of ranging interests within. But what it highlights is that at a higher level, these parties are, of course, able to push through some change. And we've seen them do that most notably by giving voting rights out to eventually, effectively, everybody in the country. They continue to suppress those groups that are against them, the Junkers and the church, the armed forces, really squashing their support and lifting up the support for the liberal revolutionaries. So they're helping the overarching liberal revolution, but they're also changing internal politics and the power structures right up the top at our dear kingy boy. And here we have it: freedom, equality, and brotherhood. And this is a really big and interesting decision around revolution in Germany. This is a pretty big deal. Freedom, equality, brotherhood, it's time. Firstly, the event that they're assessing here is around which revolutionary voice, both at the interest group level, right, those, say, industrialists within our Freedom Party, but also at a character level, right? You can see different characters with different traits. They are also assigned to different interest groups and will literally change the path of the revolution at an individual level and also the support for interest groups. So it's a really fascinating thing to see that, of course, some events are more powerful than others, but this one has really wide-reaching effects at loads of different systems within the game. At a wider level, they joke, and I think it is pretty funny, that what we've seen play out here in the revolutionary Germanic, used to be Prussian political system is this really dangerous loop. They've built up the apparatus of the state. I'll remind you, this was the autocratic state, the armed forces, the conservatives. They pushed through reforms like the secret police. This didn't really sit well with the peasantry, who still at this point, as you can see, looking at the really neat population data, by the way, make up around 50% of the population. It really didn't suit a lot of those groups who formed that Freedom Party. How did they do that? Well, they were radicalized, and that radicalized voice was able to push for change. That radicalized voice then used that very system of secret police, the state apparatus, to remove the conservatism and push their liberal revolution. Now it feeds back to the top, where the institutions of the state are now in their control. I'll remind you that some of them are good, right? We can see here them playing out good for the people. That is, things like wider educational access. Pretty good. The institutions as a whole actually are starting to have more of an effect. More on that in a bit, but first we see radicalism surging, and the impact of it is massive. So that's largely because they have an unmet political revolution. This wider political need within the country that hasn't yet been met is causing radicalism to grow. We also see some other interesting events, like the Ripper continues to rip into some new victims. The secret police may be useful to try and squash that as well. My goodness, they've got a lot of work ahead of them. Moreover, though, other institutions like the Home Affairs Institution is helping to reduce that radicalism. So you can see that it's revolution playing out at one hand and the state trying to suppress it at the other. And it doesn't necessarily matter who's at control. It just matters what tools and institutional levers they have. How did we get them? That's right, by electing the right interest groups into power and using them to pass laws. And that's really one of the key take homes from this entire episode, as we look further afield to a much more revolutionary world. We continue to debate internal politics. Should we be colonial? Should we not? We have elections coming up. But also there's a revolution playing out in Russia. Of note, in the gameplay here, Denmark and Russia are both in active revolution. You might think that would be a good opportunity for us to lurch forward while still fighting with our own internal politics. But as you can see, our armed forces group is not doing so hot. Why? Well, because we've actively sought to remove them from power. We had to end this revolution and move towards liberalism. Unfortunately, we've kind of shot ourselves in the foot a little bit here, because the king, who's also armed forces aligned with the conservatives, who are also armed forces aligned, must be squashed. So we're underfunding them. It means that we're a little weak potentially to the Austrian threat, which continues to sort of loom over us in the south. And I think I'll have to end this video here as we look at these wonderful trains, another side quest for us in this playthrough. Thank you so much for joining me. There'll be, I'd say, one more video out of this 3-hour live stream. I'm around 2 hours through editing it, and so far, so good. Join me next time as we look to move towards a unified Germany. Thanks so much for watching.